great that you're with us, and we're really looking forward to an interesting, wide-ranging discussion on the under-reflected issue of social class, particularly within our churches. So modern church is an old and progressive, 125 years old this year, progressive theological association, now originally Anglican, now ecumenical, and our aim is to facilitate and resource open-minded discussion around issues of theology, practical theology, how we live our lives in the world, social justice issues. And we have a wide-ranging programme of conferences, events, evenings like this, and always interested in new ideas, new people, diverse contributors. So do please check out our website and also get in touch. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you may well be using this evening to watch this. And yeah, be in touch. It will be great to hear from you. Our format this evening is such that if you are accessing us with a YouTube account, you will be able to make comments in the chat throughout the conversation tonight. We'll run till about 9:45, and I'll introduce our various contributors and speakers in a moment. Do consider also, please, joining Modern Church, because it's great to have as many people involved, writing blogs, contributing to the conversations, which, as I say, vary over all sorts of issues. We're a fairly generic organisation, though we are inclusive. So a lot of our stuff is on diversity and inclusion, like this evening. But we also explore all sorts of themes and issues, and it'd be great to hear from you. I didn't say, but I'm Alison Webster, and I'm the General Secretary of Modern Church. And I'm going to be chairing this evening's conversation. And I'm delighted that we're joined firstly by Luke Larner, who is the editor of this wonderful book that's going to form the focus of our discussion. Luke is a Church of England priest in the post-industrial town of Luton, and is passionate about weaving parish ministry with theology and social justice. Luke is also engaged in community organising and studying and teaching theology alongside parish life. So great to have Luke with us, and he'll kick us off in a moment. But we also have Victoria Turner, who I'm sure some of those watching this evening will know from her book, Young, Woke and Christian, which came out a couple of years ago, Words from a Missing Generation. And Victoria is a great expert on ecumenism, and her PhD was on overcoming colonialism and classism, exploring shifting theologies and practices of mission in the Iona community and the Council for World Mission. And also Victoria Turner has just taken on the reviews editorship of Modern Believing, which is Modern Church's journal, which we're absolutely delighted about, and is now teaching at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, which also links in with the history of Modern Church. So fantastic to have you with us, Victoria. And finally, Alex Frost, who is also a vicar of St Matthew's in Burnley, and another author. His book is called Our Daily Bread, From Argos to the Altar. I love that title. I think that's a brilliant title. And you may also know Alex from his Godcast, which Luke contributed to a short while ago. And Alex is also featured in a BBC documentary, The Cost of COVID, 1 year on. So you may well have seen him on telly. So welcome, Alex. Brilliant. So we're going to start off just hearing from Luke about the book. Why did you think it was important to put the book together? And what's your own kind of story of self, as we say in community organising, around issues of social class, theology and church and the way that it works? Luke, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. It's lovely to be with you all and be in the company of friends this evening as well. I don't want to talk too long because I think it gets really interesting once we start bouncing our ideas off one another. But I suppose I'll start by saying that the genesis of this book really comes about through a memorable phrase that my nan used to repeat regularly. And that phrase was, "You can't stop them shitting on you, but never let them rub it in." And it wasn't really always very clear to me as a kid who this them was. But I got the impression growing up that there was certainly an us and there was a them, and that the them seemed to make a lot of the decisions about what happened in our lives. The them operated a sphere of society that we rarely would be able to have much power over or have much decision-making power within. So I suppose in many ways throughout my now 40 years of life as of a couple of weeks ago, I know I look older, it's because I've had a hard life, but I've been trying to work out this whole thing about the them and what that means, really. I came to faith at the age of 16 and was a rather wayward child in many ways, and probably drove the lovely church that welcomed me with open arms around the bend. But I sort of quite early on had this sense of a call into some kind of ministry or something like that. I didn't have a lot of language for it. But through those early years of my faith, I faced these invisible barriers which I didn't really understand. And I found that the ways in which I inhabit my body and my sense of self were often quite unwelcome in church settings. And I've only really in recent years developed any language to be able to understand that. There's a few aspects to social class which I'm really passionate in talking about, in reflecting on theologically and engaging with practically. And I'm sure that we'll probably cover all of those in one way or another tonight. Education is one of those aspects, and there's some great stuff in the book, particularly from Dr. Eve Parker in her chapter on education. Now, the church, as any of you who tuned into the podcast that me and Father Alex did recently will know, is an institution which, let's say, I find rather frustrating at times. I'll try and limit my use of colourful language, having discovered that might get me on the naughty list recently. But what the church has given me over the last 10 years is an education that I never would have been able to access or afford myself. And that education has in many ways, I think, liberated me and given me language and frameworks to understand what's happened in my life and the lives of people around me. So I'm very grateful for that. But I also had another kind of an education. I was very happy when I left school, and I always used to say that the day I left school was the happiest day of my life because I had a pretty rough time of it. And I kind of did this and that for a while after I left school. I spent a bit of time as a missionary. I tried my hand being a youth worker in a church, but it turns out that gobby working class people like me and power hungry pastors doesn't always make a very good combination. And I ended up working for 10 years as a bricklayer. Started out as a hod carrier, which is the person that carries the bricks up the ladders to the brickies, and worked my way up to being a brickie in my own right, and eventually had my own little firm. And we had a little family firm, building extensions for people and things like that. And the education I got on the building site was sort of multifaceted in a lot of ways. I learned a lot about life and struggle and injustice and all sorts of other things from the many brilliant people I work with. I also learned a lot about the fact that there are haves and have-nots in society through that. And I remember one day working on a job for a very, very, very wealthy Christian businessman, and he was also a kind of significant Christian leader in the town where we were working. And I remember me and my brother-in-law Joe, who sadly passed away not long afterwards, digging out 2 metre deep foundations with our hands and it was pouring with rain and cold and back-breaking, dangerous work. And we were looking through the window and we saw this guy make himself a cafetiere of coffee. I know the words now. A cafetiere of coffee while we were out there slogging away. And we were sort of looking at him like puppy dog eyes through the window. And he poured himself a little cup of coffee and then threw the rest of it down the sink as he looked out the window at us. And I know that sounds like a really silly little story, but that kind of felt that and many other experiences were quite dehumanizing. And I realized that a body that works is a body that is somehow less than human. And a working class body is a body that is somehow less human or less than human, sometimes in the eyes of many people. Now, fast forwarding a bit, I joined this Christian motorcycle club, which was a really merry band of people, men and women, who were really, really rough around the edges and often very marginalised people. And I ended up kind of revisiting this sense of call to ministry there. There's a chap called Sean Stillman. He's a lovely man. He's a biker and he's leads a small church called Zach's Place in Swansea, which is the only church I know of that has instructions on how to treat trench foot is the first thing you see when you walk in the door, because a large proportion of their congregation are rough sleepers. And Sean kind of encouraged me to revisit this idea of a calling to ministry. And within that context, that felt quite possible, because in that motorcycle club was the first time where I ever felt like I could be me and be a Christian at the same time. Not in the sense of, sometimes people would say, oh, well, we all have to change when we become Christians. Obviously, we do, but that I didn't actually have to change my sense of self and my personality in the way I spoke in that environment. And he encouraged me to explore this idea of doing some theological study, which with the help of the local church I did. So I was still laying bricks 4 days a week and doing a bit of study. Fast forwarding on from there, I ended up as a lay minister here in Luton, and I gave up my business. We sold our house, raised a bit of money, and I remember being amazed that churches and Christian organisations would be so generous that they would give us £14,000 a year to live on as a family, so that I could do this ministry among the homeless. I was working with young lads being criminally exploited and all sorts of other different things. And I just thought, gee whiz, I can't believe these churches would be so generous that they would support us to do this. I was completely naive to the fact that there are pastors nearby on six-figure salaries, just in my complete naivety about how things work. In that context, I started to rub shoulders with people who were really, really on the hard edge of stuff. I mean, I've been close to homelessness in my life and had various other struggles. In fact, by today's standards, me and my dad were legally homeless at one point, although we never had to rough sleep. But I started to see that this kind of white van man narrative I'd inherited, whereby I often used to say phrases like, if white men are supposed to have all this privilege, when am I going to get mine? Was the kind of phrase I used to say. And I now realise that was very ignorant. But the reason that I said that was because I felt that people weren't paying attention to people's social class, which is true. What I learned when I met working class people of other intersections of identity, working class people who were gay or trans. I remember supporting a person from the Homeless Day Centre where I worked to go and have their first conversations about transitioning and how difficult that was for them as a person who's homeless. When I met people from majority world heritages, women, all kinds of intersections of identity who were also working class, that was when I realised two things really. One, blimey, there's some people that have got it worse than I have in this world. And secondly, what we really need to do is to come together and realise that what we as working class people have in common is actually a lot more than what divides us. Now, adding in a bit of education about things like intersectionality and class struggles through the years and all of that, I realised it's actually quite intentional that working class people are divided. And if you read the history of racism and various other struggles, some excellent stuff out there. Anthony Reddie's book, Theologising Brexit, Akala's Natives. There's a really good book recently come out called Not So Black and White by Keenan Malik. You'll see that it has always been the story that powerful people have tried to separate different working class groups and destroy any solidarity that we might build with one another, particularly through things like the trades union movement. Now, in my theological education, I was exposed to some ideas like liberation theology. Now, the first time I sat down and read Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff, suddenly this question I'd grown up with from day one about this them started to make sense to me. And I was amazed by what I was reading and how relevant it was to the struggles in my own life and of the people that I was meeting in my ministry. What I then started to find frustrating was actually that there weren't that many people really that were putting this liberation theology thing into practice, or that things were being called liberation theology, but that didn't seem to pay a lot of attention to the material circumstances that people were living. And I saw that that material analysis is really key in liberation theology. What is affecting the way people live? Who owns the house people live in? What happens to them at work, which is where they spend the majority of their time? Or there are other types of labour, like reproductive labour and other kinds of labour. What kind of power do people have within that? So these are the questions through an intersectional lens that I wanted to address through the book. I'll very briefly tell you now, before I shut up for a bit, the story of how the book came together. There was an article in the Church Times being written about class in the Church of England, and I was asked to contribute a few thoughts to that, which I did, which I think maybe were a slightly different voice to what others put forward. I then got a message from the publisher at SCM Press to ask if I'd be interested in writing a book. And my initial thought to that was no, for a variety of reasons. But when he sort of convinced me to do it, I knew two things. One, I haven't got time to write a book on my own. And number two, I don't want to, because working class experience, I have an experience of being working class as a white man who's married to a woman, and various other bits and bobs that make me who I am. I know that a lot of the other working class people that I love and respect have very different experiences of life to me, but also some that are very much shared. And that is why I really wanted to make it an edited volume where the voices of some of my mates, people with brilliant minds like Victoria, who's with us tonight, and the various other authors, taking, for example, I won't name them all, but my good mate, Father Rajiv, that I train with, talking about class and caste within the Indian caste system. Selena Stone talking about Black Pentecostal theology in class, and various other types of struggles. That is kind of what brought the book together. In it, we look at our experiences, we look at training and education for ministry, and we look at what it means for Christians to engage in class struggles today and do some theological reflection around that. So if any of those are topics that people are interested in, I'd encourage them to read the book. And if they think it's crap, do what other people have done, put a 1-star review on Amazon and write something better, because we really wanted to provoke a new conversation. And I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Luke. That's really taken us into a huge range of potential issues. And thank you for being so open about the fact that, nothing is the last word. And we need more analysis, we need more thinking, we need more people making the kind of connections that you and your contributors have been making, and how important it is to have that, the attention to, as you said, material circumstances, which, as we know, doing theology can often be the first place where people take their leave of material circumstances, when actually that ought to be right in the center of it. And at Modern Church, we have very much the focus on practical theology, and practical means material, practical means embodied. And I loved what you said about being you said a body that works can be perceived to be less than human, and the way in which you inhabit your body signals and signifies all sorts of things that are significant when we're thinking about class and And obviously that also impacts on the other forms of oppression that you were talking about. So thank you so much. The story of the cafetiere will remain with me, and the chucking of the coffee down the sink. I think that's classic. But we'll probably come back to that. I think I'm going to invite Victoria next. We didn't define an order, but I just asked Victoria and Alex to talk about how class issues are impacted on their own faith journeys. So that's a fairly wide brief, and I'm hoping you'll just take different perspectives. So Victoria, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Really nice to be here. And every time Luke says, when he introduces the book, he says something slightly different, which is always good because I've heard it quite a few times now. So you're doing a very good job, Luke, to keep the energy up. So, I think this question is quite interesting for me. Growing up, I think I had quite an implicit faith. It was very much there, but my church community where I was quite British, quite polite. Kind of, you went to church, and this church was in a working class community in the council estate next to the Tesco. But everyone in the church came from very middle class places. It was only me and my family that came from the council estate. And in that setting, kind of people would talk about the weather and traffic and curtains and blinds and cupboards in the church. But you wouldn't actually talk about, the sermon or prayer or anything personal that's going on, or absolutely not anything about the context of where you live. So I've written about this in an article, interrogating whiteness in a working class community, as I've tried to wrestle with kind of that upbringing and my own upbringing, where I grew up in this council estate, but I went to the church school, and my dad has a law degree, which he didn't use, that's why we lived in the council estate. But my parents had my dad has some kind of to be fair, understanding of education, which made me set apart from the people who were my actual neighbours. But at the same time, when I went to school, in the church school in the posh area of Cardiff, I wasn't the same as my peers, and I never really worked out why. And when I went to Bristol, I just felt like my vocabulary was so different to my peers there. Kind of, they could quote all of these names like Foucault and Edward Said, and I was like, I have no idea who these people are, what's going on. And there was just this massive epistemological and cultural gap. And similar to how Luke was kind of saying, he was like, well, I'm a white man, where's all my privilege? I couldn't kind of see this idea of intersectionality or anything. It was this myth of well, if you work hard enough, you'll get to where you need to be. So kind of anything that I failed with, I thought oh, well, I'm just not working hard enough, it's my fault. I think this quite changed when I was lucky enough with the council's board mission to go and meet a lot of other young people around the world. And they were amazing at challenging me and opening my mind. I've got a really good friend called Ian who now lives in London with me. And he often says, Victoria, when I met you, you're a Tory, and look at you now. And I was so people can't imagine that now. But yeah, I really was it was amazing just to be with girls from Nauru who were talking about the pain that they couldn't be ordained. Or people from Taiwan who were struggling to kind of talk about their faith in the public square, and dealing with things like empire and colonialism at 1920. I really got kind of exposed to these things. So it was really transformative to see how, for my peers with such different backgrounds, faith was such a formative and lived experience for them, which was completely at odds with this kind of implicit kind of faith that I kind of grew up with and thought was normal. So from Bristol, I went and I decided I really wanted to study more about ecumenism and world Christianity and mission. So I came up to Edinburgh, and I think from there, just learning more about how Christianity is understood through different people around the world, and also all of these kind of historic injustices that has been done, but also trying to work out how to hold those two things together. That Christianity has been entangled with colonialism, but also there was a reason that they went out. And even though we can now look at it and say it was misguided, there's a massive love that people did go out and in some ways subvert racism by seeing that people in other parts of the world were deserving of the gospel. And so spending so much time trying to disentangle all of these things, I think was really, really formative for me. And then in my PhD, I decided to look at originally it was young people in ecumenism, and then COVID happened and it all changed. So I ended up thinking about mission and like models of belonging together, and how kind of mission had changed as our contexts have changed. And one of my case studies was the Iona community. And I think just uncovering their story of just lived solidarity, especially when the things that people know about the Iona community are so far away from their origins. So they began as like a movement of what they call themselves a brotherhood to the working classes. And it was this like ridiculously lived kind of like, I like to use the dirty kind of like theology, this incarnational theology where Christ was seen in the person who is different to you. And it really came out of the founder George MacLeod's own lived experience when he was exposed to his own privilege. So these people were just amazing in their relationships with one another. They kind of gave up their wealth, and they kind of they tried to equalize their wealth. They went and lived in parishes where no one else would go. They were in factories, they were in mines, they were protesting with people. So it was just this really like gritty kind of theology. And gradually this changed to become more like in line with policy. So by the 80s and Thatcher, it was just really hard to be in these working class communities, especially because there weren't jobs. So there was this massive realization of, oh my goodness, there's so much homelessness, especially in Glasgow at this point. What we need to do is change the policy. And I think what my chapter was getting at was that we absolutely need to do both. I think at the moment I am despairing about the church's lack of prophetic public theology, especially with what's going on in Israel and Gaza. I think there's an issue, I think, where public theology is becoming more and more a PR exercise. So in the chapter, I talk about how the church is like Larry the cat, and they're kind of exposed to all of these injustices in the world, but they kind of are preferring to sit by the fire. Larry the cat being the cat that lives in Downing Street. So they see everything and they have this like really privileged role in society, but we'd rather just like be comfortable a lot of the time. So I kind of would like to think about how we can have like a lived witness and a public theology together. But it needs to come from the margins, and we can only come from the margins if we ourselves are aligned with the people at the margins. And the only way we can do that is if we know them and we live with them. And I think also to be able to change the world as we're trying to as Christians, trying to bring the kingdom about as lived as Jesus wanted, we know that we need to change structures, the same structures that crucified Christ. So I think it's inevitable. I think it's crucial that the church needs to be subversive to the structures that be, and how we can be a community filled of grace and compassion. But I think that we're not owning our prophetic voice because we're not deserving our prophetic voice at the moment. So I wanted to go back into that like lived experience of the Iona community to kind of expose the injustices and the realities of living in working class areas and people all around the world living in such poverty and hopelessness and despair. And I'm going to ask this question of like, why does the church think it can have a voice when we often are blinded to these kind of struggles and these people?
Thank you, Victoria. That's really helpful, I think, to bring that, what feels like the discipline of having that global perspective that you had at quite an early age, and how that can really impact. I mean, you talked about George MacLeod and the exposure to his own privilege, and in a way, sounds like that's kind of what happened to you as a young person as well. So that sort of points me to the question of how our churches now, and I probably am sharing your experience of as a young person being part of a denomination that did expose me to my own privilege through interaction with other young people from around the world, and whether we still have those traditions, whether we still invest in that. And it doesn't have to be people from around the world. It can be people from different parts of your city or different parts of your country. So thank you for that. So Alex, Father Alex, over to you for your input. Welcome.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be able to talk to you tonight from from Burnley in Lancashire. So the question was asked was, how have class issues impacted on my own faith journey? Well, probably in a way that I never thought was possible. I actually grew up in a rather affluent village on the outskirts of Burnley, a place called Worsthorne. In many ways, it was a place where people thought everybody was wealthy, but the reality for my family was that we were living on supplementary benefits, and I was in receipt of free school meals, and I was always too embarrassed to use the ticket, so I used to sell my free school voucher to somebody else and leg it off to the chippy for a bowl of gravy. I remember that's what I had for my lunch most days, was a bowl of gravy, and we lived in one room of the house. We were heated by a really dodgy paraffin heater that my dad had bought on Burnley Flea Market, that had no health and safety requirements whatsoever. Well, anyway, but so moving on from there, Burnley has been a place that I've grown up here, really. I did grow up, I was born in London, but grew up in Burnley. And Burnley, of course, is a place that's perhaps always associated with the working classes. It's famous for its cotton mills. It's famous for the coal mines, some famous but now defunct industrial superpowers such as Prestige Steel and great Universal catalogues, and Lambert and Howarth used to make the slippers for Marks and Spencer's, those kind of places. In my own secular life, I was privy to the working classes. As a store manager for Argos, I worked for Argos for over 20 years, and I became used to really straight talking punters, customers seeking good value for money alongside reasonably good customer service. Occasionally somebody not from that demographic would come in and expect something akin to Mayfair or Bond Street, and then they'd leave baffled and bemused at what was going on in this kind of world of pre-internet Argos. Prior to the pandemic, I was just settling into my first incumbency as the vicar of St Matthew's, and I was really beginning to enjoy the richness and the humour and the challenges that came with serving on one of the most deprived council estates in the country. These estates actually don't even sound very nice. One used to be called Bleak House. I mean, crikey, come on. Bleak House, the other one is called the Stoops Estate. So I was getting to know the issues around the parish. I learned that 58% of the children at my school were on free school meals. I learned that in many cases people hid what was going on behind the doors of their house. And it was only by the privilege of being allowed in that I saw the revelation that what was going on, and how horrifying that was at times. At theology college, they don't teach you how to encourage a bride to call off a wedding just a few days before the big day, because the groom had literally bet the ranch in a bit more on, and the wedding collapsed, as did the relationship. And they don't teach you at theology college how to be a pastor to a teenage mum whose 3-month-old baby's been murdered by her abusive partner. They don't teach you how to tend to families whose lives have been ripped apart by Class A drugs and alcohol. And these problems, they were already there prior to the pandemic, long before the virus smashed into our parish as hard as the recent storms that have been going on around the country. And so the pandemic for so many people wasn't something new, but it was the final nail in the coffin that was already a difficult existence. And so, however, the pandemic for me was a massive adrenaline rush. It had the opposite effect on me. I felt this burning desire to stand up and speak out for the dreadful injustice that I was witnessing. And it's interesting because for some people, when things are difficult, faith is less secure. People become more vulnerable and they become uncertain. But for me, the more suffering I saw, the more injustice I observed, the more faithful I actually became. And I'm sure many have been party to the question, what would Jesus do in these situations? But for me, in my own ministry, it had and it has gone way beyond that. I don't feel I need to ask the question, what would Jesus do? Because I know in my heart that he'd be having none of it, none of what we see and the injustice that we see. And so my experience of class issues were such as we're currently supporting a single mum with 3 children. with food because the council can't support her, because their levelling up agenda, their budget is being used to pedestrianise huge parts of the town centre. When I see injustices like a 27-year-old girl called Kelsey Devlin, who features in my book, who went to Islamabad and died, a healthy woman who died in Islamabad, and the family were told 2 days after she died. And the injustice that nobody spoke up for Kelsey. I got called there just by chance and learnt that the police weren't interested, the councillors weren't interested, the Home Office wasn't interested. Nobody gave a shit about the Kelsey Devlin. And that injustice still goes on now, all the time. And as for the church, well, its approach to social housing, social poor, to the working classes is interesting on an institutional level. It provides education to thousands of schools, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But it's stashed with extraordinary wealth that serves so many communities, so many things, such as General Synod, where I'm going next week, where they'll pay an arm and a leg and put me up and pay for my travel. You know, but back at home, everything's a struggle. You know, we don't get any financial support in our urban deprived estates. We have to beg and borrow and plead for everything we can possibly get. And so in places like Burnley, in places where I work on a daily basis, poverty is normal. It's become normalized. You know, food banks are celebrated. Do you know, I hate food banks. I hate them with a passion, because it's a get-out clause for the state. It's a get-out clause for people who should be providing in abundance for our most vulnerable people, who are gripped by addiction, who are gripped by domestic violence, by crime. These things are blossoming in my community, whilst aspiration and joy and opportunity are being deprived on Bleak House and Stoops Estate. And it's not fair. It shouldn't be like that. And it's because, you know, this isn't just about the current Conservative Party. This is about successive governments, successive councils, successive county councillors of all political persuasion that have not stood up and fought for those on the fringes of our society. Poverty is normalized. And this is where the mission of the church, in my opinion, you know, I'm not a clever academic. I'm just a working class bloke that's passionate about my town, passionate about my people. But I know this is where the mission of the church should be. But at times, it's a selfish church that we're part of. There are two Church of England benefices in my own town where they are being separated because they don't get on. What a dreadful indictment of our church. But the biggest indictment of that is on a national scale, in our difference and our intolerance to different people and different classes. So if we can't get our house in order, well, I'm not too sure what's going to happen, but people like Luke Larner are vital to our church. People like Victoria are vital to this church, but sadly we remain in a minority. I get letters from ordinands who say, oh, your book should be in every college. It won't be. I don't expect it to be, because it doesn't speak to the other. And I can live with that. I'm not bothered about that. But the challenge is that we have a duty to ensure the Church of England is the Church of England and not just the church in it. And that's probably a good place to finish.
Father Alex, thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much for that. I'm really struck by that phrase that the pandemic smashed into your parish, because I think you've given us a real insight into, you know, how, I mean, speaking for myself, you knew that the pandemic was hitting different people of different material circumstances in very different they're very different ways. But you didn't often hear, I didn't often hear apart from on the TV, the stories like what was happening in your parish. I heard a lot of what middle class parishes were doing to take worship online and to take worship on Zoom and all that kind of stuff. But that's a completely different, that's obviously a completely different set of issues as to what you were facing. So it may have been a Freudian slip to say 2 Church of Englands, but I'm not sure. Wrong, actually. So thank you so much for that. Incidentally, we do have a question from somebody who grew up in Burnley as well, and who's asking, and I'm not asking anyone to answer this question now, but we'll park it for later. What can the church do to tackle the prejudice about people from places that are seen as poor, left behind and struggling, which is another whole issue, isn't it, of stigma that you have within communities about particular parts of town or particular estates or whatever, but also within churches about different parts of the country. Even, the fact that we can't get people to serve it's harder to get vicars to serve in the northeast or in post-industrial places or whatever. So that's one to store for later. But for now, I'm going to go back to Luke to say, Luke, what stood out for you in terms of what you've heard from the others, and what would you like to just pull out and highlight?
I'll pick on Father Alex because I'm always picking on Victoria. Now that she's my boss, especially. When I first met Victoria, I said to her, "It won't be long before you're my boss, And about a year later, she's now working at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, where I go as a visiting lecturer sometimes. So I was imagining in 5 or 10 years' time, not 5 or 10 months, but there we are. Anyway, I start by saying I remember watching the documentary that Father Alex was on, and being hit pretty hard by it, but not surprised, having been, seeing injustice and suffering here in Luton that changed my life forever, and changed the way I look at the world beyond repair. But I remember seeing my training incumbent the next day after that aired, and he looked like he'd been sick all night. He looked ill, because he was so shocked. And that shocked him into realising we needed to do ministry differently in our parish church. The thing I want to pick up on, because I can sit and complain about the government. In fact, I've spent a significant proportion of today doing that, in regards to another major injustice going on in our world at the moment. But I want to pick up on talking about ministry, because this is a modern church, not a modern politics event. Now, we've heard lots of people talk about how the church cares so much about the poor and the working classes. When I was at college, we used to pray for the hungry and the poor every time we had lunch. And we hear a lot about how, we're all having to tighten our belts in the Church of England a bit at the minute because we're not bringing the money in. As Father Alex has said, we sit on a £10 billion fund, the Church Commissioners do, rather. The interest and returns of which each year could cover the pay for every stipendiary priest in the Church of England 4 times over. So we don't have a shortage of money, and we don't have a crisis of having to cut clergy posts. We have an inability to spend even the increase. I'm not talking about selling off the family silver here. We have a unwillingness to do that. What I've also learned through my union involvement with the Unite Faith Workers branch, where I'm training as a union rep at the moment, is some of the stats about how we spend our money in the Church of England. And as Father Alex has said, frankly, the Church of England doesn't give a crap really about contexts like ours, or it certainly doesn't seem to know how to give a crap, to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I know that because if my maths, which isn't all that strong, is correct, in my parish, If you looking at stipends, the average spend per head in my diocese is about £5.80 per head of people that live in this diocese on ministry. In my parish, it's 65p. It's about 11%. That's just of the average in this diocese. In my parish, 40% of children are living below the poverty line. So we have a preferential option for the rich in the Church of England, and that is sinful. And when we need support, what the church commissioners have offered us is a discount on a card reader to help us get our parish giving up a bit while they're sitting on £10 billion. I don't know any other word other than sin. Well, I do know some other words, but we're in polite company here, so I'll keep them to myself. But I just want to hear the truth, to be honest. I'm at a point with this, with what's happening to our brothers and sisters in the church in Palestine at the moment, where I'm sick of hearing lies from Christians. I'm sick of it. Just tell the truth. Just don't pretend that you care about the poor. I was thinking just today, as I prepare my Remembrance Sunday sermon, about Saint Maria of Paris, who took in refugees, falsified papers to help Jewish people escape the Nazis, and was ultimately put to death in a gas chamber for her troubles. And her famous quote from her diary was, "Piety, piety, piety, but where is the love that moved mountains?" So I suppose that's all really I think, and I know that from our conversations, Father Alex would probably be with me on that one. All I really have to say to the Church of England and any other church denomination that is not operating on a preferential option for those who are struggling, whether they're the working poor or the so-called undeserving poor or whatever. Piety, 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 but where's the love that moves mountains? Where is it? Just stop lying about it or change your ways.
Yeah.
Thank you, Luke.
Alison, can I just come in on that? Because just to back up what Luke's saying there is that we, just to give this a little bit of context, at St Matthew's we were given a pioneer curate who came, and Reverend Cat, a wonderful priest, and we because of the circumstances, the church gave us a 5-year plan, and Reverend Cat stays with us. But it is all contextual. It is all, what's if we give you this, what will we get back? And so we have Reverend Cat with us for 5 years. And just to give you an example, we have Cat set up this wonderful thing called Fun Church, where we have about 100 people come on a Monday and they get a meal and everything. That costs us as a church. We have to pay for that. And the church is run like a management business in many ways. So if we don't justify that financially, so one of the questions was asked, if we give you Cat for another 5 years, and you bring in 50 or 80 people, how much will they bring into the church in hard pound notes? And the question they asked was, well, do you think they could give a fiver? And the reality is that no. Some of them can't give anything. Some of them sweep up what's left on the plates, off the plates. They haven't got any finance to give. And so the reality is if we can't show a financial reward or a payoff, the chances are that we'll lose Cat in, well, what will be now 3 years. And then what happens? We go back to where we were. I'm 54. I'm not getting any younger, and I can't do the work of 2 people. But we really should be feeding into these communities. Burnley is just one example, but for every Burnley there is a Luton, and there's a Bradford, and there's a Leeds, and there's a Blackpool, and there's an inner city London. You really don't see it. You don't see the investment, and that is the injustice that I think is the biggest injustice of everything.
Thank you. And I think that when you were first telling that story, Alex, and you said Cat's done this thing where you're bringing in 80 to 100 people every week, and I'm thinking, wow, 80 to 100 people every week who are coming within the orbit of the church. It's almost as though that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
because there's no financial reward, and that's to me, you know, what are we counting?
But the reality of that, Alison, is the people that I've described, you know, are in a certain starting point. They're not ready to rock and roll full on Christians. You've got to nurture them. You've got to care for them. You've got to feed them. You've got to cry with them. You've got to weep with them and sit with them and hold their hand. There should be no KPI attached to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to ask Victoria, what and Alex, that's not got you off the hook of saying what you've noticed and what other people have said. So Victoria, what would you like to pick up from what you're
I've been like following all of the thoughts as well, and I also just despair at how we are just constantly worshipping mammon, and like all of our institutions and all of our churches, we're ridiculously idolatrous towards money, and we're like, yeah, it's what it is, isn't it? And it's like, no, it's not what it is. I just find it really frustrating. So Alex, you were talking about how, like, you know, just there being like poor people and austerity and stuff, how this is so normalized. And it just gets to the point where it's just like nobody cares. Like, you can tell all of these stories. You can like weep with people. You can serve people in food bank. You can go on TV, and just that kind of apathy, I think that that we have in society, that is what kind of causes me like a lot of despair. Actually, that end result when you see so many things, and you're stuck with that image, and just you're constantly conveying it, but it feels like you're like not getting anywhere. And I think this is something really concerning, obviously, but also I guess maybe it's also something to point out in the church, that if we're struggling as relatively, we all have pretty different backgrounds, right? But I guess in church denominations, at least, you've all kind of trained in the same way, maybe with different kind of stances. You all serve in a kind of similar situation. You have the same calling or vocation, at least. Yeah, when we go to things like General Synod or IMURC, so General Assembly, it's so easy to group off. And there's a lot of animosity. So if we can't even talk to each other as a group who all have the same calling towards one another, how on earth are we going to be this prophetic instrument of the church that is able to speak on behalf of and with the poor and marginalized, the people whom society has literally sucked a voice out of and made the underclass? Like, if we can't listen to someone who's like slightly different to us, like how on earth can we go even outside of that comfort? So I think this lack of imagination, this lack of creativity, what you were both talking about, and these issues with the church, and the church just operating as a capitalistic system. So in my PhD looking at the London Missionary Society, it intentionally moved away from that capitalistic system. So it started as like donors would give money, they would become trustees, to the piper who pays the money like does the tune kind of situation, right? So they would give the money. They intentionally said, wow, this is a bit rubbish, because these churches in the non-Western world, they have their own money now. So you have people from Samoa with nothing who were giving money. We also had enslaved people, which is a pretty black dot on the history, were giving money to hold up the church. So it was this like intentional decision that actually, no, this is wrong. And it created the Council for Admission, and they said, actually, everyone is putting into this part. It's unequal, but the inequality is not coming from the lack of piety. The inequality is coming from the lack of society. And so the church, this mission, needs to operate in a way to subvert those structures. What a prophetic moment, right? Equally in the Ionic community, I've talked about how this intentional idea that they all kind of lived on the same income, and they gave their surplus elsewhere. I found this article in an accountancy journal that talked about how this was unjust and it was intrusive, and how this kind of like personal telling someone else like your financial things is like an element of control, and they just didn't get it. They didn't get that like this was actually a good way to live. And I think we're just so constrained with politics, with everything that's going on, which isn't normal. Having lying politicians to our face is something new. We've not had that before. They at least tried to cover up their lies, and now they're glorifying them, right? So I think there is just a lack of us kind of putting our foot down and being like, what's going on? And just to finish, exactly. I think this needs to be at the core of the church. So thinking about where Jesus would be now, for me, when I was in Bethlehem, you had queues of Palestinians who would be at the wall, so the checkpoint, and they would be queuing to be able to go and to be able to work in Israel, because that was where the money was. And they'd wake up at like 4:30 in the morning, and they'd stand in this queue for the checkpoint for hours. Jesus was a Palestinian man under Roman occupation. That's where he would be. So being in solidarity with the working class is being in solidarity with Palestine. It's being in solidarity with refugees, with women, etc., etc., etc. And so I think the church, like, it's ridiculous how our attention is on mammon, money, longevity. Well, what do we want longevity for if we've lost our original vision and our incarnation as Christ?
Thank you. Wow, the issues are stacking up. They really are stacking up. We have got a couple of other questions that I'll come to in a minute, but I'm just going to give Alex the opportunity to respond to what stood out most powerfully for you in what Luke and Victoria.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. I think what Victoria said about the historic injustices that are there, I think we're actually creating our own historic injustices right now. And I think, if we learn anything of historic injustices, that we stop them from being injustices of the future. And I think we're guilty, and we are actually creating these historic injustices for 20 and 30 years down the line, particularly for the working classes of this nation. Every penny that we acquire comes from anywhere but seems to come from the church. We reach out to the charity sector to help us. We have to borrow. We have to ask nicely. I'll give you an example. We've just had the release of our parish share at St Matthew's. It's £59,000, and we will get some rebate on that because of our environment. But I argue that we shouldn't pay a penny in parish share when there are plenty of churches out there who are sitting on bucket loads of fortune. This is a point that Bishop Philip North has raised on numerous occasions. If we're to be a truly Christian institution, then the distribution of the wealth needs to be much fairer. And that happens when, one of the things I picked up when I did the TV thing, Alison, was that lots of middle class people rang me up in their highfalutin voices, said, "Oh gosh, is it really like that in Burnley? Is it really like that?" As though it was some sort of drama that we'd created. And I think that is one of the injustices, is that we're talking about other stuff, which kind of leads me to Luke's points. I think a huge question has to be right now: what is the mission of the Church of England? Is it to dwell in its difference? Is it to try and get the higher ground on somebody who has a different feeling or sexuality or gender? Well, if that is the mission of the church, it shouldn't be. It should be about this, because that's what Jesus teaches on the Sermon in the Mount, in the Beatitudes, on the Sermon in the Mount. And Luke's point about them and us. I want to see the bricklayers rolling up at Cuddesdon. I want to see the fishmonger, the cleaner, the sewing machinist, because that's then we are being truly reflected of what the Church of England is or should be, but we fail that, and I saw an image today on Twitter, somebody looking very grand outside Ridley College in Cambridge. I want a theology college in Blackburn or Blackpool, in the heart of where it is, because I find those images very uncomfortable. It's almost as comfortable as seeing the king in all his robe talking about poverty that Rishi Sunak's going to solve. It's just as uncomfortable. So I think there's some huge challenges for us. Them and us. It really is them and us. It feels like them and us, and I don't know who can turn that round. I really don't.
Yeah, thank you. We did have a question which was about the how theology, this is interesting talking to someone who's now a tutor in a theological college, and two of you have been to theological colleges or ministerial training. It's a big question, but the question was, the training process is geared towards those from middle class backgrounds, and how can that be changed?
Alison, can I just say, I had no qualifications, and how I got through that, I can't tell you how stressful it was. I thought I just had to turn up at a BAP and convince people that I'd been called by Jesus Christ to serve in his church. But it turned out to serve that I could do an A-level, and I could speak the Queen's English, and I could use language that was completely alien to me. And it was only by the goodwill of my family and my closest friends that got me through it. Because otherwise I'd have thought, stuff it. If this is what you want, then I can't do it. And then I felt awful, because I couldn't really do it. It was dreadful.
So the suggestion was, what about an on-the-job apprenticeship program, and whether that would be more.
We do have that in a sense, right? So when I was training, I was based still here in Luton, carried on doing my chaplaincy at Homestay Centre and various other projects and things, and was able to put that into conversation with the learning at theological college, which I'm lucky to have a brain that can just about cope with that kind of style of learning, just about. But the point for me, I suppose, is, shouldn't that be the norm? Like, shouldn't it be that we're all able to train in a way where we learn the practical skills of how to serve in contexts like this? Because you go to a theological college and you learn all the skills of how to deal with high society Oxbridge types, but you don't learn any of the skills of how to sit with someone who hasn't eaten a meal, or how to hold someone's hand when they've no idea how they're going to pay their rent this month, or whatever the thing is. So I do think, I suppose, the danger in the them and us thing, let's look at it a bit of a different way. I suppose at this stage, I'm not even asking for it to be possible. I'm not even saying everyone should train to do ministry in a context like this. I'm just saying it should at least be a significant pathway of how we train people to minister in contexts like this. My bishop, Bishop Richard, the Bishop of Bedford, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, he trained at Cuddesdon, and he was based at a patch in Sheffield. And he used to have, as part of their core training, Mordinans from Cuddesdon came and worked with him on an estate in Sheffield for a year or so as a significant part of their training. I mean, that should be the norm. That shouldn't be an exotic extra, right? That's a pathway people can follow. So it really is. The frustration for me, although I enjoyed the academic side of things, no one taught me how to do the practical stuff. And then particularly when you go just from the model of charity and putting your finger in the dam to actually trying to start to build enough people power to really address any of these issues. I mean, I learned more by doing 5 days training with Citizens UK than I have in 10 years of theological education. And that's just wrong, I think, and I know that's changing, and I know places like Cuddesdon are trying to incorporate that training into their syllabus and things like that. But it really must be the norm if we're going to say that we're following Jesus of Nazareth, if we're going to say that we're supposed to do a ministry which is shaped by someone of whom their mother said, what is his ministry going to look like? It's going to look like casting the mighty down from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. And it's going to look like sending the rich away empty and making sure that the hungry are filled. Like, we should learn how do you do that? Otherwise, it's just words. If we think that Mary and Jesus actually meant it when they said that stuff,
there's both a methodological thing here, isn't there, Luke? But also there's theological imperative to me around, and it came back to what Father Alex was saying about who do we give a shit about, to use your words. You know, you said nobody gave a shit about Kelsey Devlin. And then you cited, Alex, various situations that theological college had not prepared you for. So I guess the question for me is whose experience is mattering? And this is not just about theological training for vicars, is it? It's about the whole church, lay and ordained, and how we what we think of as, you said, normal and normalized in terms of poverty, but this is not just about poverty either. So it's a whole raft of things, but it feels like there's always kind of, this is the nature of power. There's one experience which becomes the normative experience, and then there are the marginal experiences and the marginal people that stories never get heard. And in a way, the media makes that, in some ways, ironically, Alex, you're hearing the impact that your documentary had on Luke's vicar, training incumbent. So there are positives in there, but it's breaking open the stories that we hear and who's allowed to speak and whose experience counts for anything. And
it's what the theological education does to the ordinand. You know, we've had 3 vacancies in Burnley. We've had him for about 18 months. Nobody seems to want to come. I'm not sure that's the case in a Leafy Lane parish in Oxfordshire. You know, you've probably got 30 ordinands all saying they're called by God to St Giles in Oxfordshire, you know, and nobody's being called to Burnley. What does that say about our theological institutions?
I think you're pointing to something quite important. I'm obviously going to have to be quite careful with my answer. I think there's an issue with funding and accessibility for theological education. I think theological education is a beautiful time, and it's getting further and further reduced by the church that wants to just expedite people and put them straight in a parish and say, okay, we need people there, let's put people there, tick the box. It's not a time for formation. This is beautiful time of building relationships, understanding God, testing yourselves, like placements. We've been doing now ecumenical placements and community placements, and like I agree that the academic can sometimes be like, I've just got to get through it. And I think this is an issue we need definitely, and I mean, I know the common awards are, but more work on like accessibility for that academic style. And I'm getting maybe more and more convinced that like part-time training and even full-time training for like single parents and things like that is ridiculous. To train to become a priest or minister in any kind of sense is like such a hard task, like spiritually, mentally, emotionally. And so there needs to be so much more support around that, I think, from the central church. And I think BAP is quite like an anxious process as well, isn't it? And so I think we're working alongside that. But my point, before that was a massive sidetrack. My point was, I think you're pointing to something quite good about how these theological colleges become quite insular communities. And I mean, Ripon College Coniston is in the middle of the countryside. I'm a very city person, so I'm struggling with that anyway. But I am wondering about how you can open it up so it doesn't become this own insular community, which is what we're having a problem with these institutional churches, right? Also, URC, we see the same people, Church of England General Synod, you see the same people. And also interesting with the Church of England and the URC, you kind of see people jumping to the national kind of church structures and ignoring those kind of district councils and the smaller, boring stuff, right? Because they want to be like the celebrity style big things. And like, it's almost kind of that like forgetting, I don't know what my point was, being intentional about the community around you, and that we're not just one community, but we are a space who belongs to like the larger, and especially in the Church of England, like surely your ecclesiology is that there is no close parish, you're for everybody. So this idea of counting heads, I don't understand how that makes sense to your established church.
Thank you, Victoria. Actually, we do have a comment from somebody just about the whole, and this is another whole big issue, right, about the whole way the parish system works in terms of you've got to have people taking on certain roles, like you've got to have church wardens, you've got to have PCC members, you've got to have this, you've got to have that, and actually that imposes a whole range of jobs which have been done in a traditionally middle class way, and that's become the way they've all got to be done. So if you are in a parish where those people are not there or cannot come forward or actually have other things to do with their time, then the whole system, it feels like, is kind of on a knife edge or is falling down. So I think at all levels, there's something about the structure of the church as we know it, which is not being porous enough. It's been too insular at every level. And I think what Luke is saying around the community organising practice, which breaks open at best, it's breaking open that insularity and enabling engagement with people of difference. And I did want to come back, Luke, just in the last couple of minutes to the whole issue that you raised at the beginning about intersections of identities and how power, the question of solidarity across difference, particularly amongst people of working class origin. And I just thought that was a really powerful. It's powerful because it's also been part of nonconformist movements emerging when in previous generations, when we've had churches that have not spoken to, like the Industrial Revolution, when the Anglican Church was not engaging with working class communities in cities. It was not engaging with places where there was poverty. And it took Methodists and others to come along to do that task and to go out to where people actually were and actually were doing their work. So, I mean, I don't know whether, Luke, we've got just less than 4 minutes left, but whether there's anything more you wanted to say about and anything that Victoria...
All I'll say very briefly on that is, for me, it's not just about how those kinds of relationships work out within church and within Christianity, but it is to say that, and I want to be conscious about the kind of language I use here, but when I spend time with my friends who are leaders of other faiths in this town, when I spend time with creative people, artists, because I don't know if you knew, but working class people can be creative as well and have remarkable gifts and actually have really great things that they can give to society, sometimes that are even better. From within my own religious framework, I don't want to impose my religious framework on them, but from within my own religious framework, those people are Christ to me. Those people evangelize me. I meet Jesus in those people. And I find something so special in connecting at a human level with those people who teach me so much. So the solidarity comes, I think, not through the abstractions of a kind of intersectional theory, but by recognizing our shared interests and joining in shared struggle together. And I think that happens primarily locally. I'm a firm believer in the local. It's why I think the parish system not too bad a way of organising things. But then as we come together locally, I think that makes it possible to organise on a bigger scale. But it is when people become names and faces, not isms and all the rest of it. That's when things seem to change for me.
Thank you. Victoria, Alex, can I invite you to make a final comment about anything that's important?
I think what Father Luke has said there is really beautiful, and I'm pleased because it was what I was thinking. I can't converse it as well as Luke has, but the what you get back from these people walking alongside them is so beautiful. They grow me more than anything else, more than going to a study group or frankly even reading some scripture. They feed me in an extraordinary way, and they thought their addiction becomes my addiction because I'm just drawn by these people to keep trying to speak out for them, and it's a wonderful ministry, and would be loved by more if they were given the opportunity. maybe a regional Cuddesdon, Victoria.
Satellite, how about it? Victoria, did you have? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I quite, yeah, like we should hope that kind of the church, the default is ministering to people who are at the edges of society, and I think whilst doing that, we can pray that they'll stop being those edges, and we can kind of rethink collectively and imbue this creativity, and not enable people who have no creativity but who have qualifications to run our country. So I think this is really, I think, a really important work, and I'm really feeling quite privileged at the moment to be able to teach students from such diverse backgrounds, and the stuff that I'm learning from them, and bell hooks and how to teach is being incredible.
That's a really hopeful place to end, I think, Victoria, because if you're experiencing that as somebody who is teaching now, and engaging with a cohort of students for the first time, and that diversity is there, then that's great. And I think I guess what I'll take away from this as the chair, abusing the chair probably, is just this sense that a church which only represents a particular sector within our society, which I think is where we're in danger of coming to that place, is actually a middle class only church is a deprived church, because it is not a church that is learning from, is not seeing God in the way and the full diversity of I, as a middle class person, know how under-resourced I am in all sorts of things around survival and resourcefulness and imagination and creativity, because I've never, struggle is what creates a lot of stuff that we as a whole church need to be the people of God, and not just a subset of that. So I just want to thank you, all of our contributors, and the people who've been sending messages, for everything that you've brought this evening. And I kind of feel like we need to revisit this, and it's such a huge agenda, and I know we haven't done it justice, but what you have all brought has been really really important and really fantastic. So thank you so much, and thanks everybody. We look forward to future events and to